Hafa a day! My name is Jack Mandeville, and this is Jacked History. The date is December 8th, 1941, just one day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The island of Guam, a U.S. territory for over 40 years, sat at the southern point of the Mariana Islands. Though originally Spanish and briefly German territories, the other islands in the Marianas were taken over by Japan over 20 years earlier in World War I, switching one colonial power for another. Since then, Japan had been enforcing a policy of Japanese settlements in the islands, and the Japanization of the indigenous people to the point that the islands were populated by more Japanese people than native. One island in the group stood alone, Guam. And now that Japan had already declared war with the United States, they wanted their hands on it so they could have complete control of the region. Let's backtrack just a bit before we proceed. If you watched my episode about the Spanish-American War, I made brief mention of the US acquiring Guam and the Philippines, even though I mostly focused on the fighting that occurred in Cuba and Puerto Rico. Guam had been a Spanish territory for 230 years when, in 1898, during the beginning of the Spanish-American War, a single United States Navy cruiser showed up to the island where the small Spanish garrison there immediately surrendered by accident. Surrendered by accident? Jack, how the hell do you surrender by accident? Well, I'll tell you how. When the US ship fired 13 shots at the Spanish fort, Spanish officials, thinking the United States was trying to make friendly contact with a naval gun salute, casually boarded the ship and were surprised to find out that the United States and Spain were at war, and they were now prisoners of war, because nobody back in Spain gave them the memo. So flash forward to December of 1941, and the United States was fully aware that they were at war with Japan. And Japan, after attacking Pearl Harbor, was on a blitzkrieg to capture as many islands as possible in the Pacific before the United States and allies could mobilize a response. They surrounded the small American garrison of over 500 sailors and Marines with a numerically superior force and had the United States surrendering the island in just 2 days in what became known as the First Battle of Guam. Guam and the indigenous Chamorro people who inhabited it were in for a rough few years. I assume there's varying degrees of knowledge about Japanese military occupation during the World War II years, but I'll keep it simple just in case you're completely unaware. It wasn't the greatest situation to be in. I mean, don't even get me started about what happened in China and Korea. It would take hours and I'll probably get demonetized for it. The Chamorro themselves are a multi-ethnic group of folks in the Greater Marianas and Micronesia. If you watched my episode about Polynesian roots and movement around the Pacific, the Micronesian peoples, which the Chamorro fall under, share some of the same origins as the Polynesians. But when you add hundreds of years of Spanish influence, along with some sprinkles of American and German influence, what you get is a unique melting pot of ethnicity on the island of Guam. Simply put, many Chamorro can check the box of being both Pacific Islander and Hispanic. For the Chamorros of Guam, they were thrust into a forced Japanization of the island. The English language, American currency, and basically anything American were strictly forbidden. Every aspect of Japanese culture was to be forced down Chamorro throats. And like many other Japanese-occupied places during this time, any resistance could have your neck meeting the sharp end of a sword. Homes were destroyed, food was rationed to the point that people were starving, all contact with the outside world was cut off. And since Japan had a war to fund, all boys over the age of 12 were forced into labor battalions as Japan was in the midst of squeezing every agricultural element out of the island that it could. That's a fancy way of saying they were using people for slave labor. Enter 16-year-old Vicente Tomas Garrido Blaz, better known to his friends and family as Ben. By 1944, he had been working in these Japanese labor battalions since he was 13, in the 2.5-year occupation by the Japanese. He was not only a tall boy for his age, but as the massholes would say, he was wicked smart. Like all Chamorro, he was not liking the Japanese treatment of himself and his fellow islanders and was ready for the United States to be back at the helm. And as Japan faced more difficulties in their overall war efforts, they came down even harder on the Chamorro. Executions became more common. Forced labor became even more intense. At one point, the Japanese forces marched over 10,000 locals into the heart of the jungle with nothing but what they could carry, so they could do more forced labor. Well, wouldn't you know, it just so happened that on July 21st, 1944, the United States Marines and Army were landing back on Guam for what would become the Second Battle of Guam. 3rd Marine Division, specifically, was able to establish a beachhead in the early part of the battle, but intense confrontations made it difficult for them to push further into the island until early August. Seeing that the Marines had arrived, young Blas and a friend escaped their Japanese captors and made their way to the American lines. At first, the Americans thought they might have been Japanese, but after a brief interrogation, they realized the boys were from Guam. Alright, I'm gonna be honest with you. I just think the idea of a bunch of 20-year-old white dudes, the Marines who showed up, who grew up in the Depression, in places like Midwest or the South or urban Brooklyn, and had never even left their hometown until World War II, interrogating a local boy like Blas is funny. I imagine it went something like this. Hey, Sarge, lay off the kid. Stop asking him so many questions. I know he kind of looks like him, in the eyes, but if you ask me, I think this kid might be Mexican. Oh, no, actually I'm Chamorro. Yeah. Like an Asian Mexican. I gotcha. There's 7 Puerto Ricans that live in my neighborhood. I know a Mexican when I see one. Who knows? But that's the way I imagine it in my head. Anywho, these Marines were from 9th Marine Regiment under 3rd Marine Division. Blas would say years later, "We were hungry, frightened, and barefoot. But when the Marines came, we were free again." But Blas didn't just get freed and leave everybody else stuck under Japanese rule to fend for themselves. No, he shared intelligence of Japanese positions with the Marines of the 9th Regiment, helped carry supplies and wounded Marines, and even guided troops through the jungles with his knowledge, until on August 10th, 1944, the Japanese were defeated and driven from Guam. Guam was free again and back under US control. And almost 1 year later, the war would be completely over. Although it should be noted the last Japanese soldier to surrender in Guam was Shoichi Yokoi in 1972. God damn! Back on track. So Ben Blas lived happily ever after as a local fisherman, right? Fuck no! Like I said earlier, Blas was a smarty pants. He got a scholarship to Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, and, upon graduation in 1951, was commissioned as a lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. He served a solid 29-year career in the Marine Corps, starting in 1951, where his first duty assignment was in Japan of all places. But it was in 1972 that everything would come full circle, when Colonel Ben Blas took command of 9th Marine Regiment, the very unit he made contact with as a boy in 1944 and brought the liberation of his native Guam. How can you not be romantic about that? He served in a number of other important duties, including the Chief of Staff of the Fleet Marine Force Pacific and the commanding officer of Camp Butler in Okinawa, before he retired as a brigadier general in 1980. Okay, so he's retired now, and a general of all things. Sounds like you need to retire in Florida and golf every day with your lawyer neighbor named Ruben Steinbaum, right? Wrong!
Use grill your ass off on your Chamorro pork. Use grill your ass on your Chamorro beef. Use grill your ass on your Chamorro chicken. Because when you use grill your ass off, you're always winning. This is a contractually obligated ad read. I'm gonna send my invoice to Jason Murph of Grill Your Ass Off.
Blas was elected as a congressional delegate from Guam and served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1984 to to 1992, with a seat on the Armed Services Committee, and he always advocated for Guam. His last years were spent authoring books and articles, and hosted a television series that talked about Guam history and culture. He died at 85 years old in 2014, and was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Which, not to plug anything at this point in the show, but we did an episode on that. Blaz said of his service, "The Marines gave me back my island, and I decided to give them my life." In October of 2020, 6 years after his death, Marine Corps Base Blaz was activated on the island of Guam. It was the first new Marine Corps base in almost 70 years, and it couldn't have been named for a more appropriate person. Let's just hope it doesn't tip the island over. Please like, subscribe, hit that notification button, and share this episode and others if you like what I'm doing here.
My fear is that the whole island will become so overly populated that it will tip over and capsize.